At some point when you're creating code, you're going to want to actually create quotes or block quotes. And this is what you should use when you're quoting somebody, whether it's from a speech, lyrics from a song, something from a movie, whatever it may be. If you're quoting somebody, you should use the quote or the block quote. Now, the difference between the two is quote is meant to be used inside of other elements. It's an inline element. It's meant to be used when you quote somebody inside of a paragraph or inside of something else. So it's kind of like a parenthetical quote. But for instance, we have this little quote that says, "I have a dream" by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Instead of actually typing the quotes, we instead want to put the quote tag. Now this is going to seem kind of weird because right now we have quotes which are showing up in here, so it looks like quotes. But when you see these straight lines, when it's the straight line type of quote, that's meant for measurements, whereas the curly quotes are meant for actual speech. So with this quote, we're going to remove these two quote symbols, and we're going to just put a Q tag around the beginning and ending of that quote. So this is where it gets weird. When we look in here, there are no quotes around this particular "I have a dream" part of speech. But if I were to save this and preview it in the browser, when it opens up, it will add the quotes in for us. In addition, when we have something like a screen reader, it's going to read to somebody, it's going to say, quote, "I have a dream" by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or quote, "I have a dream," unquote, by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So it's more meaningful, it's semantic, and it's the way you should use quotes. Now, if your quote is really long, for instance, this whole part of speech, this entire part of his "I have the dream" speech has many different paragraphs inside of it, and I don't want it to be taken as my words, but his words. So if you've ever taken an English class where that uses block quotes, you'll note that when there's a block quote, usually we have to indent that quote so there's a visual separation between your writing, which is normal paragraphs, and what the block quote is. So here are all these different chunks that mention "I have a dream" in his speech, and around these we're going to put block quote. I'm not going to put a block quote around each chunk because this entire piece is one block quote from the same speech, same person. So around the entire thing, I'm going to wrap the block quote. Notice now that it does indent this block quote. However, we're not done. Now, if you were just putting a block quote together and it was one or two lines and it's fine that they were together in one paragraph looking block quote, then this would work just fine. However, because we have these separate chunks in here, each separate chunk needs to have its own paragraph around it so that inside of that block quote, we can have some of that visual separation. So just to make life easier, I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste. And for each of these, I have to remember to close this paragraph. So imagine song lyrics. If you were to put song lyrics for an entire song in a block quote, which would be proper, or a really long poem, which would be proper, then you would need to make sure that each stanza or each little chunk was surrounded by a paragraph tag, and then the entire thing would be in a block quote. So if I come over here, now we can see that this entire block quote has been indented, and then each of the little chunks of it have their own separate space between them, so it's a lot easier to read. So again, if I save and preview in the browser, now we have some visual separation that shows us when we have the quotes inside of a paragraph, and when we have a block quote, we have that indentation that tells us this is something different than what I've written myself in these paragraphs. In addition, again, this is going to be easier for screen readers to read for people with disabilities, and it'll be easier later for me to style the block quote. If I want to make the block quote all italics, I can do that because I can say the tag block quote should have the style of italic font. Whereas if I chose paragraph, then it would turn all the paragraphs in my site italics, and we wouldn't want to have that happen.